Mr. Carnegie, could you tell us a little bit about how the world that you are dealing with as a security analyst, I guess, executive, is changing? What are the challenges that you're confronting now that maybe didn't exist 5, 10 years ago?
I think, and it's a very good question, and it depends on where you're focused. And you said the world there. So I sort of centre myself out of the Middle East, the UAE, but with a focus across the Middle East and Africa region. But that essentially is impacted by the wider global social or geopolitical situation. So I think, to answer your question, when you look at what the impacts of the US, Trump, the Trump effect, Putin, the Ukraine war, China, Yemen, the Houthis, Iran, okay, the list goes on. All of these put into one melting pot affects the social situation in the areas that I focus as a security professional.
But we've always had, various different challenges which rise and disappear. The Middle East has always been a region where there has been security and stability. Are there any kind of trends or anything which you see really as a kind of game changer in the world that you work?
I think, sort of trends, essentially you have, an increasing demand for raw materials and commodities. You have political instability. You have countries that are rich in minerals, and we're in Africa today, and this is a classic example, that have find it a challenge to recover and respond to changing events, and particularly now. And because we have the further impacts of global warming, the sort of race to carbon net zero, and all this type of stuff, we see that, some of the areas that in the past, and if you would say 10, 20 years ago, were not so attractive to be in, are now very attractive because they're needed. And so you have this race, and it's a bit like if you go back 150, 200 years to the 1860s and that sort of land grab for Africa. You're kind of seeing that again, and that causes friction and tension, whether it be with the countries where are rich in minerals or commodities that people need, and their ability to be able to sort of control external influences, and that when you kind of put that and put it and measure it against threat, vulnerability, and the asset, which is sort of security language that you would look to assess how you would sort of protect something, as it were. It means that the impacts of what are happening are significant.
That's quite a grim picture when you're talking back to the sort of colonial era and the sort of renewal of that race for assets, if you like. What do you think people get wrong when they're thinking about security? I'm thinking particularly of companies that maybe come to you. What are the things they underestimate, or what are the things that they're not thinking about that they should be?
Perception. Okay, now perception on the side of the country that they're looking to enter, the market they're looking to enter, the asset they're looking to, or the commodity they're looking to extract, of the people that own it, on the ground in the country, in Africa, and the perception of the foreign investor, which are two totally different. So the perception of the country that's, say, rich in gold, and you have a company that wants to come and mine the gold. The perception will be that this foreign company that wants to come in and take their mineral asset, will not, and their perception is it will go back to that sort of colonialism, that sort of period where they come in, take the land, take everything out of it, and leave them with nothing. And the perception of the investor will be, when we go into this country, we're going to be met with hostility, we're going to be met with bureaucracy, we're going to be met with corruption, we're going to be met with, and the list goes on. Now, if you were to take a step back and look at that and manage that perception from the outset, I think it would be a very different picture.
So actually what you're saying is security is often a lot about communication as well, that these companies need to be thinking about how they are seen, what they are saying about what they're doing and what they're doing, as well as just protecting themselves physically.
Yeah, and media communication programs, corporate social responsibility programs, they need to be addressed from the outset. And I've worked in many places in the world where if this had been addressed again from the outset, and they'd looked at corporate social responsibility, communications, working with, and I used to do a lot of work in Afghanistan and Iraq, for instance, over the last 20 years. And if you understand the sort of the tactical level tribal dynamics. Okay, and then a phrase I always used to use is if you look after the people will look after your project, and it's a kind of the strap line could be better, I suppose, but it's very true. And if you empower the people, give them the asset, they get back what they need. Some of these people live in a very sort of subsistence, hand to mouth, environment, and and I look at when I went back, if I go back 10 years, I was working in the Niger Delta, and hand to mouth subsistence living. And then all of a sudden you have the big Western, IOCs that are coming in there, international oil companies, who are getting rich on, the oil they're pulling out of the ground, and the local people have nothing. Now, communication will not solve that, but if communication and corporate social responsibility had been addressed 50 years ago, they wouldn't have the problems they're having now. And I think this is a problem that we still haven't learnt from in, 50 years later, and we're in this situation.
You mentioned Donald Trump and America. How is the kind of American, let's say, as I see it, disengagement from the rest of the world impacting the work that you do and the challenges that you see your clients facing?
Yeah, well, we see, and Donald Trump's mandates to, which he enforced the day after he took power, in cutting, for instance, US aid in some of the countries that we work in. That just sees the flow of cash, stop immediately. People went to work the next day and they had no jobs to go to. And when you look at the sort of the impact that has, polio programs and various different programs that are life-saving to these people. So that essentially then disenfranchises communities. Communities then start to, right, well, what can I do? They don't have an ability to earn money, to look after their families, to feed their families where they are. They have no foreign investment or aid, so it means they go elsewhere. What happens then is they get hoovered up by some of the terror groups or bad threat actors, as you'd call them. And they've already got the hook in because they're already disenfranchised with the sort of bigger, geopolitical situation and the impacts and the flow down that's having to them. And that then is, great for these people that want to get them into, Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or something like that, because they're now, well on their way to having the motivation to join these organizations, which has a counterproductive effect, because then you have to counter that and you have to spend money, you have to invest to stop terrorism, to boost economies. So it's a self-perpetuating, very negative wheel.
And I want to ask you about the other side of that as well, because the disengagement of the US is often seen as a kind of counterbalance of the increased engagement of China, especially in Africa. Is that a force which makes the world safer, or is that, from your perspective, a force which creates more uncertainty and more risk?
Unfortunately, the latter. What we have then in the industry is what we call a race to the bottom. Okay, so you have the various different countries that are looking to get into some of these Africa, Middle East, sort of wider areas, Central Asia. They compete against each other. You've got the Turkish, Chinese, American, European, and it's essentially the influence that China can have in terms of repaying or paying national debts, taking stakes in land, and they know that some of these countries will never be able to pay that debt back. So essentially, they then have a stake in the land. So what you find then happens is, the likes of Turkey now have to compete with that. America looks at it, and other countries wider afield. I live in the Middle East, and there's a lot of Middle East countries now that are looking at investment and capitalizing in their ability, but they have a different approach. They look at it very much from a collaborative approach, where essentially they can go in and work with governments rather than trying to take advantage of a disadvantaged situation to their long-term gain. So it destabilizes.
Thank you. Just two more things I think I'd like to ask you. What do you see changing over the next 5 years when you look forward and you're thinking, how do we prepare ourselves for a world in which maybe technology is playing a bigger role? Maybe it's the climate crisis you're talking about. What are the things that you see changing that you're going to have to be helping your clients to adapt to?
I think technology. I think we're in the AI race now that is familiar to most people, but not so to sub-Saharan Africa. I think when you look at Africa as a continent, commodities rich, the world could survive on the commodities in Africa, but unfortunately it's not being handled properly. But with the introduction of technology, with the various different communication infrastructure that's being put in place, it will see a boom in communications, Pan-Africa, which essentially is going to affect the ability of African nations to be able to, to lift their GDP economy and then essentially look after themselves in a better way. And I think that will have a huge impact. And certainly, where we are today in Morocco, this is a hub for Africa that is very much, it's a very secure environment, has great connectivity, and is a great platform to launch what I think the next generation certainly in the security sector, where we're going to see what the most impactful changes are going to be, and it's going to be around communication and artificial intelligence.
So, in a sense, the globalization of knowledge is, you think, going to be a thing that actually makes the world better?
I think it is. I think it needs to be managed, though.
That's very interesting. Thank you. The last thing I want to ask you is a bit that comes very close to my heart about the media. I'd be really interested what you see in the media that frustrates you, that annoys you, where you see the media getting things wrong, misunderstanding things, because we don't all have the depth of expertise and background in some of these areas that you have, and yet we write about it, and millions of people read what we're saying. Are the things that you watch and it just really frustrates you, or you read, and perhaps you can talk to me just about some of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things when you get a media, a newspaper, or a news channel, it will generally be affiliated to a way of thinking. Certain people will read whatever, which is absolutely fine. But I think when you get the what I would call open source research, where people are searching media online and putting reports together with maybe an element of bias, because they probably don't have a tactical level understanding of the area that they're reporting in. Essentially, you have not misinformation. You have something that's been reported that's not accurate. And I find that in a lot of stuff that we do, we provide information intelligence to organisations that want to work in difficult environments. And the nuanced part is to actually get people that are on the ground with the access to the information that you can then task them to collect, process into what you're trying to produce for your clients that's more accurate. So it's getting that granular level, atmospherics, mood, sentiment, all these type of things that really do are missing, I think, sometimes in some of the broadsheets.
And do you think there's a particular area where that manifests itself?
Well, I think we're in Africa, and I think some of the areas that are reported on are inaccessible. So it's very difficult to do what I've just said. It's a very easy statement, put someone on the ground, and so I think that's a challenge. But I think Pan Africa, if you break Africa down into the regions, northwest, central, east, they are all unique with their own challenges, whether it be terrorism, people migration, famine, whatever it might be, which means it's very difficult to do that. So I think that's something that if you were to say a broad area, I'd say Pan Africa for different reasons.
So just to recap that, you think that in general the media doesn't have enough expertise and doesn't put enough effort into maybe understanding some of the issues in Africa?
I think I wouldn't say it doesn't have enough expertise. I would say that the point I'm trying to make is do you have the nuanced, granular level detail, the atmospherics, the mood, the sentiment of the people, what's actually happening on the ground, as to rather what's been researched at a higher level.